He's just played over it, and success for Panasa.
Hello and welcome to episode 30 of Radio Cricket. That is 30, Shahid Afridi's mental age in 17 years' time. I'm Nishant Joshi. You may remember me from such podcasts as Jadeja Time, a brief biography of India's greatest hope, and Shag, Marry or Kill, a cricket fan's guide to the Australian cricket team. I'm privileged to be joined today by someone who puts the man in man I could sure use a dose of cricket satire, joining me live from the deepest bowels of Eastern Europe. I would say he's the one and only, but let's be frank, it's a pretty fucking common name. It is James Marsh.
Yes, hello Nishant. Yes, well, lovely. Yes, it's lovely to have a dose of your dulcet tones in my ears. So, how are you?
Yeah, James, I had an excellent weekend. I actually paid a visit to the home of Pakistan cricket. That is to say, I went to Yorkshire. In particular, I visited Bradford, or Bradistan, as I like to call it. I was there for my uncle's 60th birthday party, and it was a grand occasion, and we had a lovely time. But sadly, it did mean that I missed out on a lot of cricket over the weekend. So throughout the event, I was watching India versus England unfold live on Twitter by keeping in touch with our Indian followers. And as far as I could make out, it seemed like India got about 14 LBWs not given against Peterson and Cook, and also Sachin Tendulkar was robbed twice in the match. So, James, as someone who was present for the entirety of the match, what did you make of it?
Yes, it does seem as if your family may well have been the only Indians celebrating over the weekend, because it was a stunning victory for England, and probably one of the most unexpected English triumphs abroad since Mick Hucknall was invited up to Helena Christensen's Copenhagen penthouse for coffee. It did bring to mind Adelaide in 1995, when a win in a live Ashes test was at the time about as common as a Stuart Broad wicket. So it was just really rather astonishing after the capitulation in Ahmedabad. And we must remember that England had lost 7 of their previous 12 test matches played this year. And in the previous match, they had looked like rabbits on cocaine in the headlights of a car being driven by Sebastian Vettel in a hurry. India notched 327 batting first, and only one side has scored more than that first up at the Wankhede and lost. That was England, who made 347 in 1993, and then they crumbled in the face of Cambley and Kumbley. And what made Kevin Peterson's innings of 186 so extraordinary was that people were suggesting India were about 80 or 90 ahead of par because of the wicket, and I actually think that was fair comment. The pitch didn't flatten out, apart from when Ashwin was bowling, and even including Cook's 100, Peterson scored more than the rest of the England top 6 combined in that innings. In Ahmedabad against Oja, he looked like a particularly anxious cat having kittens on a hot tin roof, and so I suppose that served to show that he was genuinely nervous about his return to the side. But in Mumbai, he was absolutely masterful, and I think after some of the really quite unpleasant and borderline racist stuff that was written about him back in the summer by some journalists such as Michael Henderson and Peter Oborne, I think people like that are going to have enough egg on their face to make a pretty substantial omelette, which I hope they choke on. But Nishan, it was obviously an incredible turnaround from England. You obviously didn't see the match, but what was it like to come back from England and see this aftermath of misery on Twitter from Indian fans?
Yes, well, James, as you say, it is only England's 3rd test win in the last 20 years in India. It does seem like it was England's greatest victory in India since Lord Mountbatten learned how to eat a chapati with one hand. But on the flip side for England, they do still have a few question marks. In particular, the place of Samit Patel is under question with the imminent return of Ian Bell from England. And also, the place of Stuart Broad is particularly under threat. He has been less effective in this test series than a fishnet condom. And Stuart Broad really has been the type of bowler who prospers in home conditions and in seam-friendly conditions, like in England and in South Africa. But if you look at his record in the subcontinent, it is particularly woeful. And recently, in 7 tests in Bangladesh, India and Sri Lanka, Stuart Broad has taken just 11 wickets at an average of nearly 70, which does show just how much he's struggled to adapt. And what's been particularly concerning for the England management here is that he just looks completely drained, he looks half injured, and he looks like he's not bowling with any sort of heart as well. And the problem with Broad is that when he's not bowling with that sort of viciousness, that sort of bastard mongrel attitude that he has in him, And when he's just whining and whining all day at the umpires for not giving him an LBW which wouldn't have hit a fourth set of stumps, he really does become a dog without teeth. And to be honest, it does seem like Stephen Finn is going to take his place. I do believe he's taken 5 for 50 in the warm-up match today, and Stuart Broad didn't even get a ball in India's second innings when they were bundled out for 1-4-2, thanks to the awesomeness of Monty Panesar and Graham Swan, who picked up a remarkable 19 wickets in the match between them.
Well, indeed they did, Nishan, and I would prefer to focus on the somewhat fearsome eyes of Monty Panesar rather than the pretty ones of Stuart Broad, because it was a complete vindication of his selection, and indeed a complete vindication for anyone who thought England's selection policy had become more rigid than Shane Warne at a beach volleyball match. As you say, Monty fired, he took 11 for 210 in the match, his best ever, and it was a really magnificent display of spin bowling. He bowled pretty quickly, but also with some loop and masses of turn, and the ball which got Sachin in the first innings was a genuine corker, although Tendulkar did play across it like an Italian grandmother sweeping her front steps. But speaking more generally about the Indian Malays, where do you think they can go for the third test?
Well, I think it would be a rather knee-jerk reaction to make any sort of wholesale changes to the Indian lineup. I mean, you've got players like Yuvraj Singh, who's coming under a bit of pressure, but he has arguably got some emotional credit in the bank, which could be a touchy subject if and when it comes up, and it does look like it might well come up pretty soon, and we could well have a bit of an inquest into how Yuvraj was actually chosen and the reasons as to why Yuvraj was actually picked for the test side when arguably he hasn't actually been ready for it. But I suppose that will all come out in due course. For India, as I say, it's not a time for panic. It's kind of ironic that just a week after we're talking about England not making any wholesale changes, the Indian media is now going to typical overdrive hyperbole mode, and they're talking about retirement, players should be dropped. And as I said, Yuvraj is someone who should be coming under the scanner. Harbhajan Singh is another player whose place should really come under the scanner right now. He bowled 21 overs and took 2 wickets for 74 runs. He was pretty ineffective, but at the same time, Ravi Ashwin was the main bowler who was really disappointing for India, bowling 42 overs and nabbing just 2 wickets for 145 runs. But he has been excellent for India in the recent past, and I do think he also has a fair bit to go. Just last week, as I said, we were talking about how much he's progressed. It's no time for India to really dig deep within themselves and start asking hard questions. It is only their second defeat at home in a test since October 2008, and in the intervening period they've won 14 out of 23 tests, and their only other defeat came against South Africa 2 years ago. So it really is just one of those tests where everything kind of went wrong for India, and to be fair to England, they played out of their skins. Perhaps India need to go into their reserves a bit, test out their spinning bench strength, because to be quite frank, preparing a rank turner at the Wankhede and then choosing Harbhajan was like calling for DEFCON 1 against an imminent invasion, lining up your shores with a fleet of battleships and tanks, and then loading up your artillery with a bunch of love hearts.
And now in obligatory Sachin retirement speculation news. Obviously there's plenty of debate about whether Sachin should stay or whether he should go, but you know, for me, I don't want to betray too much of my own private life, but Sachin's situation at the moment is like a relationship where both people know it's time to say goodbye, but they keep going out for candlelight dinners at expensive restaurants in the hope that it might provide the spark for their once magnificent and peerless love to return. When they get to the restaurant, however, they just end up fidgeting awkwardly in their seats. The food is always disappointing, and a terrible silence descends as they trudge back home in the evening drizzle. In Mumbai, it was Monty Panesar serving up the unpalatable offerings, but in the last year, there have been plenty of other bowlers who've made Sachin look a bit queasy. I think if Tendulkar has a true friend, not just the type of guy like Ravi Shastri, who tells you everything will be alright and that she'll start loving you again if you just give her a bit of space, then that true friend has to take him down the pub, look him in the eye and say, "Look, Sachin, that was the most beautiful woman any man in history will ever go out with, but she's no good for you now. If you love her, let her go."
And now to goings on down under, where Australia and South Africa played out a thrilling test at the Adelaide Oval, and despite it ending in a draw, I think both sides will go home very satisfied. We saw many highlights in this test match, including a double century from Michael Clarke at a rate of knots. We saw a century from Michael Hussey, another failure for Ricky Ponting. We saw some lion-hearted bowling performances, including Peter Siddle, who bowled 63 overs in the test match, and we saw an incredible backs-to-the-wall debut ton as well by Faf du Plessis, who's been coming under a lot of flack in the last 18 months ever since his infamous run-out of AB de Villiers in the World Cup quarter-final against New Zealand. He actually teamed up once again with de Villiers in the second innings as South Africa stonewalled Australia on the final day, which they started 4 wickets down, and somehow they held out for a draw. And all this without even mentioning the incredible performance of Imran Tahir, who ended up with 0 for 260, which is the single worst performance in Test history. In fact, it's the worst performance since Megan Fox in the last movie starring Megan Fox. Tahir was offering more freebies than a second-hand car salesman, and it really was quite an embarrassing moment, especially in the second innings when Tahir was searching for some sort of redemption. He was looking for some sort of new, fresh start, and he actually had Ed Cowan caught at cover, and he gestured towards the crowd, which was pretty much baying for his blood at that point, and he gave a gesture beckoning to them, saying, "Who's laughing now?" And it was only a matter of seconds before the third umpire showed that Tahir had in fact overstepped, and that the wicket was actually bowled on a no ball. It was the single most embarrassing moment on a cricket field since Cameron Akmal forgot to drop a catch at Sydney.
Well, indeed, yes. Well, I think Imran Tahir must have gone to the Virat Kohli school of diplomatic relations when in Australia, Nishant. But yeah, it was somewhat embarrassing for him. But just coming back to some of those tremendous individual performances you mentioned, AB de Villiers actually batted for 220 balls without scoring a boundary, which for such an attacking player was an act of self-restraint on a par with somebody meeting Joey Barton and not immediately punching him. You also had Callis, who batted for 2.5 hours in the second innings with a hamstring injury, which brought to mind his 2 knocks at Newlands in 2011 to save a test against India when he'd ripped an abdominal muscle. So his contribution shouldn't be dismissed either. But as you say, it was du Plessis' knock which really stole the show, and he has been incredibly castigated since that World Cup quarter-final.
Mainly by us.
Well, indeed, mainly by us, but it was, in a way, it was really rather wonderful to see him turn things around. I think he has shown a bit of character before, because South Africa went on a tour of New Zealand earlier this year, and he scored it was only a sort of 50 not out to win an ODI match, but after he'd been basically gangbanged by half the New Zealand side in that World Cup quarter-final, when people like Carl Mills, Vittori and Ross Taylor jostled him like school bullies stealing the new kids' dinner money. But he showed in that innings, in that ODI, that he did have a bit of character, and they really were genuinely lovely scenes to see him congratulated by his teammates as he came off the pitch, having saved the game. Yeah, also, as you say, it was a superhuman effort from Siddle. He took 4 for 65, and he was bowling pretty long stints considering the heat at the Adelaide Oval. And yeah, sure, while he might not win any World's Sexiest Vegetarian awards, I think he does deserve a lot of respect for the effort he put in, even though Australia couldn't quite pull this off. But heading into the final test at bouncy old Perth, Nishant, how do you think the two sides might go in terms of selection?
Well, as we mentioned before, James, Peter Siddle did bowl a superhuman spell, bowling 63 overs in the match, and really was completely flat out by the end of it. And with it being back-to-back tests, it does look like a strong possibility that he might sit out the test match. Ben Hilfenhaus also had a huge workload, and as such, Australia have actually called in John Hastings, Josh Hazlewood, and our favourite player, Mitchell Johnson, in for the next test at Perth. And of course, Mitchell Johnson has an excellent record at Perth as well. He averages just 18 there with the ball, and he has some happy memories against South Africa at Perth as well. Australia have also recalled Shane Watson, who has been crocked for the past few weeks and past few years perhaps as well. And it's also worth pointing out John Hastings being called up to the Australian Test side. Not many of our listeners may have heard too much about him, but he has played a handful of ODIs and T20s for Australia. Before last year, he suffered a really bad shoulder injury, had to have his entire shoulder reconstructed, and he really is a sort of unglamorous player who hasn't really attracted a lot of headlines, but been plugging away at domestic level for Victoria, and quite an incredible story just how strongly he's come back with his wickets and lower order runs. I think he could really do a job for Australia in the shorter formats. To be honest, I'm surprised, very chuffed for him that he's been called up to the Test side, because I really thought that it was a long way away. But possibly our listeners, being such T20 aficionados, will know John Hastings better as the man who opened the bowling with Sohail Tanvir for the Kandurata Warriors earlier on in the Sri Lankan Premier League.
Sure. It was a formidable partnership, which I never like to miss, Nishan. But the only thing I would say, I'm quite excited to see Hazlewood in the squad. I think he did impress during the Champions League T20, but my only concern is, of course, we had Pattinson breaking down again in this Adelaide test after he'd bowled 53 overs at the Gabba. We've already got Cummins out, so my only concern about the 21-year-old Hazlewood coming in is that young Australian quicks do seem to be about as fragile as a crystal sculpture of Mitchell Johnson's ego.
And that brings us to the end of another episode of Radio Cricket. Thank you very much once again for joining us. We do hope you have enjoyed our company once again. Until next week, I've been Nishant Joshi.
And I've been James Marsh.
Goodbye.
I think it was a very poor performance. One of the worst things I have ever seen done on a cricket field. Good night.